Hi, I'm Lee Kelso, host of the HealthCall LIVE Radio Hour. I'm glad you're here as we take a closer look at the intersection between psychology and social liberties. What are we going to do about mass shootings, and particularly in situations where the suspect has been on the radar screen and seems to have slipped through? So our guest today is someone I wanted to bring to the table because of her exposure as both a political candidate and also a psychologist. Her name is Angela Plowhead. She recently stood for election in the state of Oregon, is hoping to become the Republican candidate for Congress. Thanks for joining us.
Thanks for having me. It's a really important topic, and I'm glad to be here.
It is a tough one, isn't it? We've talked about this before on the program, so I'd like to hear your thinking on this. We are at that intersection of psychological challenges in a population that feels sort of lost and abandoned. We've heard from this suspect that he felt alone until he found a hate group. What does that tell you about kind of what's happening in the social zeitgeist?
I think there's a lot of stuff that's been going on. We've seen this push in our schools that really, I think, has isolated kids. Instead of bringing them together and really focusing on how people are the same and how people actually can work together and kind of celebrate how we're different, but not be bothered by how we're different, but yet still be okay with just looking at how we're the same as well. And it's really caused a lot of division. I think there's been this huge push in the media to focus on racial justice issues and looking at race, but I think they've been going about it the wrong way. I think the way that it's happened has really caused a lot of division and really kept people from coming together. And that, I think, it's part of what you're talking about here with this young man saying, I was really isolated. A lot of our children are made to feel as though they have something inherently wrong with them. And it doesn't really matter what their race is. This is a piece that I think we've done a really poor job of in pushing a lot of the social justice pieces, instead of trying to help all children feel like they are okay and that they are able to succeed. Here in Oregon, we've seen this big push to do away with all standards, but instead of helping kids feel successful, it just makes there's nothing that they have to strive for. And so I think all of these things are further contributing to the mental health crisis that we have in this nation, where we have record rates of suicide, anxiety, depression in our youth. And now we have all of the issues with, fentanyl and other drugs that are causing deaths here in our nation, especially amongst young people.
Yeah, this whole death and despair issue, I think, is something that we're going to have to pay some more attention to. So we've seen in this young man's writings that he felt he was deceiving his parents. He was keeping from them what he was planning. He hadn't told anybody in his family, but he had said at school that he was planning a violent attack, and he was brought under psychological evaluation for that. New York is a red flag law where they can take weapons away from somebody deemed to be at risk. How do we miss this? You're a psychologist. How do you get to that point of when is danger possible to the extent that we need to remove social liberties?
So I think you're exactly right, because we have the Second Amendment, and the Second Amendment applies regardless of what's going on in our lives. There are some instances in some states where they do have these red line laws, which I don't actually agree with. However, what I will say is that there is a place there for our intelligence communities, the FBI specifically, to step in and do something. So when we have these people that have demonstrated that they have a desire to harm our nation, to harm other people in these mass shootings. I think there's been enough of a problem with the mass shootings throughout the last couple of decades that this should be on the radar of the FBI, and without having to take people's civil liberties. So there's already laws on the books that allow them to investigate terrorism. And this is what this is. It's an act of terrorism. And we see this repeatedly where people will have indicators and not actually be on the radar of law enforcement. And I think that's where we need to change it, is that when people actually demonstrate that they are a danger and they're making statements about mass destruction, then that's when they should come onto the radar of our intelligence community and be followed up. Our intelligence community has been spending a lot of time looking at political issues and looking at, parents and other things like that without actually following up on some of these kinds of issues where there actually is harm and there is a danger. And people have stated that they have an intention. And so I think that's where the fine line is when someone has had that sort of evaluation, that sort of statement. That's when we need to be following up on these kinds of things and then keeping those people on the radar.
So are you suggesting that as a psychologist, if someone makes that admission to you, should we have a legal obligation to report that? Is that existing today?
Those already exist. So we, as most health professionals, have a duty to inform if there is a legitimate risk to others. And this risk was already identified by the school. And, this happened in the last mass shooting that we saw happen a few months ago, where the school identified a risk. It was reported and there was no follow-up after that. So this young man, he was identified, he was evaluated, he was only kept for a day and a half. But it takes a lot in order to keep someone, to admit them at all, actually, in our society, much less to keep them. So to keep them for a day and a half, where we're falling down in this nation is with the follow-up. So we have so few psychiatric beds that those people are so overwhelmed, those providers are so overwhelmed that they oftentimes are not able to do an appropriate follow-up plan. So they might have the plan in place, but then there's no follow-up after that to make sure that the plan was actually enacted. And we have so few providers in the mental health arena that oftentimes you can't get in right away if you can find someone that can take you, or they don't have a specialty that is appropriate for the problem. And so there are things that can be done. We could have reciprocity of licensure across states, which would help to alleviate some of those problems where, you have states where there are more providers that could be assisting across state lines. So that would be one thing that we could do to help with that issue, to make sure that there were enough providers to go around to manage the needs. We could also be doing things like changing our Medicare rules, so that way you had more than just psychologists, social workers, and psychiatrists that could see people. So there are a lot of master's level providers that could be taking on patients that can't through that type of insurance.
Hadn't considered that. There was a case in Indianapolis, actually just about a year ago, with a young man who opened fire at a former workplace, a FedEx depot. Several people were killed. Many of them were of Indian descent, although it wasn't clearly indicated that was a racial motive. This young man had been on the police radar. They had visited his home, I believe even the FBI. And his mom tried repeatedly to get help, warning people that he had mentioned suicide by cop, and yet she was unable to get any action. Where is that hole in the system? Is it just the fact that there aren't enough professionals, aren't enough beds? Is there something else at play here?
I think that's a big piece of it, but there's also this other piece that has to do with interaction with law enforcement. So right now, our law enforcement is so overwhelmed. I know in our state, there have been rules put into place that prevent them from actually arresting people unless they've committed a crime against another person that endangered the other person's physical welfare. So that, I think, is another piece of this, is that we have not enough law enforcement resources as well. And with the whole defund the police movement, that only made things worse, where now we have much fewer law enforcement on the streets that are able to actually engage in these things. We have a very large state physically, and just geographically it's large. And we have some counties that only have 3 sheriffs for an entire county. So that's an area that we really need to be paying attention to, and making sure that when there are issues like this and there's a concern for safety, that there are enough law enforcement officers and that there's enough space that they have in the jails, if that's what's called for, to actually house people once they are arrested. We need to have accountability, and we need to have it at every level. We need to have it in the schools, where when schools are contributing to problems, that there's some correction there, that they're identifying things appropriately and reporting them appropriately, that once it goes from that level, that the hospital staff have enough providers and enough space to actually care for the number of people that are coming in. We have an aging population, and that piece of our structure, our healthcare structure, has not been well managed. And so, we're dealing with multiple problems on multiple fronts, but yet we don't have enough space. We have very few psychiatric hospitals here in my state, and I'm sure this is a problem throughout the nation. And so we're just not doing many pieces of this well.
Do you have, as should you be elected as a candidate for Congress? I know you just ran in your primary. If you were to get to Washington, where would you place that priority? What do you think needs to be our national focus?
So I think this is a piece of our national security. And, that's the job of the federal government, is to make sure that our nation is secure and safe from threats from within and without. And so I think it needs to be part of the very tops in our priority, that make sure that not just on the foreign field, but also, throughout our nation, that we are making sure that crime is managed well, that mental health issues are managed well, because that's a piece of it, right? I know here in our state, homelessness is a huge issue, and that's a big piece of what's going on there, as well as what's happening with our kids. And so if we're not helping them to manage these pieces, then how are they going to go on, manage their academics and then go on and compete on the national and international level? There are a lot of pieces that aren't working well, but they all come back to some pretty salient aspects that have to do with our national security.
So in your psychology practice, are you seeing this whole despair issue? Are you feeling that as a big increase for people?
I think that's what we're seeing across the nation. We've had 4 pediatric societies, as well as our Surgeon General, that have come out and stated that we have a national crisis when it comes to the mental health of our youth. But this has also been an issue related to, everything that happened with COVID and the lockdowns. Anytime you have that isolation of people, which was a huge aspect or a huge problem of that piece of what happened with the lockdowns, and that here in our state, it went on for a very long time. And we still had a mask mandate until March of this year. And so, we've even had research come out that talked about how the utilization of the mask is a barrier in relationship building and being able to read another person's emotions and make connection with them.
Yeah, I think we have to leave it there. There's just no easy answer. It's a difficult problem, but the more we talk about the mental health side of it, I think the better off we're all going to be. It's Angela Plowhead.
Yeah, absolutely.
Psychologist, also a candidate for Congress in the state of Oregon. I appreciate sharing your thoughts.
Thank you for having me.